There is a question that has haunted sincere believers for centuries, not the loud, obvious questions about murder or theft, or the sins that make headlines and fill courtrooms, but a quieter, more unsettling question. A question that tends to surface in the still, honest moments before sleep, or in the middle of a worship service when the music is beautiful and something inside you refuses to fully open, or in the private aftermath of a prayer that felt mechanical and empty even as you were saying the words. The question is this: what if the sins most likely to destroy us are the ones we barely notice? What if the greatest spiritual dangers in our lives are not the ones that announce themselves with fanfare, not the obvious failures that produce guilt and shame and public accountability, but the ones that creep in silently, disguised as virtue, hidden beneath the surface of a life that looks, from the outside, completely fine? What if a soul can be hollowed out gradually, incrementally, almost imperceptibly, while the person it belongs to continues attending church, reading their Bible, using the right vocabulary, and believing themselves to be in reasonably good standing with God? This is not a hypothetical concern. It is one of the central preoccupations of Jesus Christ's entire teaching ministry. And the more carefully you read the Gospels, not quickly, not devotionally skimming for comfort, but slowly and with honest attention, the more apparent it becomes that Jesus was not primarily concerned with the dramatic, obvious sins that everyone already knows are wrong. He addressed those, yes, but the targets of his most extended, most passionate, most searching teaching were something else entirely. They were the interior conditions of the human soul that resist easy categorization, that hide behind respectable behavior, that produce the appearance of righteousness while systematically undermining the reality of it. Jesus was, above all else, a physician of the soul. And like every great physician, he spent the majority of his ministry diagnosing conditions that his patients had not yet recognized in themselves. A good doctor does not spend most of their time treating the obvious broken bones and visible infections. They spend their time looking for the conditions that develop silently, that have no dramatic symptoms in their early stages, that patients mistake for normal life until the moment when the damage becomes too advanced to ignore. Jesus came to find those conditions in the human soul, the ones we would walk right past if left to our own self-assessment, the ones we have elaborate systems of self-justification for not seeing. This is what makes his teaching so radical, so perpetually unsettling, so impossible to fully domesticate even after 2,000 years of the Church's best attempts to make it comfortable and palatable. In an age like ours, an age of unprecedented connection and unprecedented spiritual isolation, an age where religious identity is increasingly tribal and performative and detached from the transformative interior reality it was always meant to express, the silent sins Jesus warned about are not historical curiosities confined to the world of first-century Pharisees. They are active. They are present. They are at work right now in churches and living rooms and quiet bedrooms and private hearts all across the world. They may be at work in your life. They may be at work in mine. And here is the thing about silent sins. The silence is not accidental. These are not conditions that simply haven't been noticed yet, the way you might not notice a slow leak in a tire until you wake up one morning and find it flat. The silence is, in many cases, maintained. We keep these conditions quiet because looking at them honestly is uncomfortable. We keep them unnamed because naming them means we can no longer pretend they are not there. We keep them unexamined because genuine examination might require genuine change, and genuine change is costly and disruptive and tends to unsettle the stable arrangements we have built our lives around. But here is what Jesus knew, and what every genuine tradition of spiritual formation has confirmed. The cost of not looking is always higher than the cost of looking. The wound that goes untreated does not remain stable. It spreads. It poisons. The spiritual condition that is never honestly examined and never brought to the light does not simply sit quietly in its corner. It grows. It deepens. It shapes your character in ways you don't fully perceive until you look back over years and realize that you have become someone you never intended to be. Someone harder, colder, more self-absorbed, more distant from God and from other people than you were at the beginning of the journey. That is the work of silent sins. That is why Jesus warned about them. This video is not meant to produce shame. Let me say that clearly and sincerely. The goal here is not to send you away feeling condemned or spiritually defeated or overwhelmed by the distance between who you are and who you think you should be. The goal is the same goal Jesus had when he delivered these warnings in the first place. He did not warn people about dangers he believed were beyond their capacity to navigate. He warned people because he loved them, because he believed in their capacity for genuine change, because he saw the potential in every human soul for real transformation when that soul is honestly surrendered to the work of grace. The warning is itself an act of love, an act of faith in the person being warned. So we are going to walk carefully and honestly through 12 of the silent sins that Jesus specifically identified in his ministry. We are going to look at what he actually said in context, in the full weight of the language he used, without softening the edges or domesticating the challenge. And we are going to ask the question that every genuine disciple must be willing to ask. Not about the person sitting next to them in the pew, not about the public figures whose failures are easily catalogued, but about their own interior life. Is this in me? That question, is this in me, is one of the bravest questions a human being can ask. It requires a willingness to see yourself clearly, to let the light of truth into the corners you've kept carefully dark, to lay down the elaborate case you have built for your own spiritual adequacy, and sit instead in the honest, uncomfortable reality of who you actually are. It is deeply uncomfortable. It is also, without exception, the beginning of every genuine spiritual breakthrough in the history of the faith. You cannot be healed of a disease you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot be freed from a chain you insist is not there. You cannot grow towards something you will not admit you have not yet reached. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to genuinely connect with you specifically, whoever you are, wherever you are watching this. Right now, in this moment, people are watching this video from living rooms and kitchens, from hospital beds and college dorm rooms, from quiet Sunday mornings and late Tuesday nights, from locations spread across every inhabited continent on Earth. From the United States and the United Kingdom, from Nigeria and South Africa, from the Philippines and South Korea, from Brazil and Argentina, from India and Australia and Canada and Germany and places I could not begin to list. There is something extraordinary about that reality, something that feels, to me, like evidence of the very Spirit of God moving across the surface of the world, drawing people together around His Word, finding seekers in every language and time zone and cultural context, because the truth we need is the same truth, and the hunger for that truth is genuinely universal. If this channel has meant something to you, if these videos have fed your faith, challenged your thinking, given you something solid to hold on to in a difficult season, shown you something in Scripture you had never seen before, or simply made you feel less alone in your honest wrestling with the things that matter most, then I want to ask you, sincerely and warmly, and with genuine emphasis, to subscribe if you haven't already done so. Please hit that subscribe button. It takes 2 seconds, it costs you nothing, and it makes an enormous difference in allowing this community to grow and this work to keep reaching people who need it. Turn on the notification bell while you're at it so that the next video finds you when it's ready. And while you're here, please drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I love knowing who is on the other side of this screen. Every time I read those comments, London, Lagos, Manila, Melbourne, Chicago, Toronto, Nairobi, Jakarta, something lifts in my heart, because it is a reminder that this is not just a channel, it is a community, a gathering across every boundary the world uses to divide people, of men and women who care about depth, who want their faith to be real, who are not satisfied with a version of Christianity that sits comfortably on the surface and never asks anything difficult. You are part of that gathering. You belong here. And if you want to go even deeper, if you want to be part of something more intentional, more connected, I want to invite you warmly to consider becoming a channel member. Members get early access to videos before they go public. And more than that, they become part of the inner circle of this community, a closer gathering of people who are committed to serious, honest, growing faith. If that sounds like something you want, the link is right below this video. We would genuinely love to have you with us. Now, let us begin. Sin 1. The sin of secret pride. Of all the sins Jesus addressed with the greatest frequency, the deepest passion, and the most sustained and detailed teaching, pride occupies a singular position. But it is essential to understand from the outset that the pride Jesus was most concerned with is not the obvious, blustering variety that everyone can see from a distance. The person who openly boasts, who constantly redirects every conversation back to their own achievements, who wears their arrogance like a badge. That kind of pride is visible, and visible pride, while certainly a spiritual problem, at least has the decency to identify itself. The pride Jesus returned to again and again with something approaching alarm is of a different and far more dangerous species. It is the pride that has learned to dress itself in the clothing of virtue. It is the pride that operates within religious devotion, that uses spiritual practice as a vehicle for self-congratulation, that has convinced itself, and this is the truly terrifying part, that it is actually humility. This is what the tradition has sometimes called spiritual pride, and it is the most difficult of all the varieties to dislodge precisely because the person who has it does not recognize it as pride at all. They experience it as discernment, as wisdom, as appropriate awareness of their own faithfulness. The most devastating portrait of this condition in all of Scripture appears in Luke 18, in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Two men go up to the temple to pray. The Pharisee stands and prays, and notice the precise language Jesus uses. He prays about himself, not to God. About himself, directed nominally toward God, but functionally self-addressed. He thanks God that he is not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, and then, with what must have seemed to him like commendable spiritual precision, he specifies, he fasts twice a week, he gives 1/10 of all he gets. Let us be completely fair to this man, because fairness is part of what makes the parable so searching. Every single thing he says is almost certainly true. He almost certainly does fast twice a week. He almost certainly tithes with meticulous precision, possibly more than most people around him. He almost certainly has not committed adultery or robbery in any literal legal sense. He is not a hypocrite in the straightforward sense of the word, a person who claims virtues they don't have. By every external metric of religious life available in his culture, he is genuinely exemplary. He has worked hard at his faith. He has made real sacrifices. He has sustained real disciplines, and he knows it. And yet Jesus delivers one of the most stunning and unambiguous verdicts in the entire gospel. This man, this careful, disciplined, genuinely devout religious achiever, goes home unjustified. He goes home with his relationship to God unchanged, unimproved, no closer to the reality of divine communion than when he arrived. The tax collector, who stands at a distance, who will not even lift his eyes toward heaven, who beats his breast with the physicality of genuine anguish and says only 7 words, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." This man, the social and religious outcast, goes home right with God. The contrast is absolute. The mechanism behind it is worth spending time with because it is the heart of the entire lesson. The Pharisee's prayer reveals the fundamental corruption of secret pride. He has transformed his spiritual life into a mirror rather than a window. Prayer, in its essential nature, is meant to be a window, a transparent opening through which the soul looks outward and upward toward God, the source of all light and life. The Pharisee has converted prayer into a mirror in which he studies his own reflection. Instead of encountering God in prayer, he is encountering himself and finding the encounter deeply satisfying. His religious practice has become, at its innermost core, a mechanism for self-congratulation. He has replaced the living God with his own spiritual achievement as the functional object of his devotion. He worships at the altar of his own faithfulness. This is not ancient history. This is a 21st century problem in exactly the same form, operating with exactly the same mechanism, producing exactly the same spiritual damage. How many of us read our Bibles not primarily to encounter God, but to feel good about the fact that we read our Bibles? How many of us attend church, not primarily to worship, but to maintain the self-image of someone who is the kind of person who attends church? How many of us engage in theological conversations not primarily to seek truth together, but to display the breadth of our knowledge? How many of us look at people who are visibly struggling with sin, addiction, broken relationships, public failure, and feel, if we allow ourselves to be genuinely honest, a quiet but real sense of relief and superiority that we are not where they are? This is the Pharisee's prayer in modern form. The content is different. The structure is identical. Secret pride is the sin that makes you measure your spiritual life against other people rather than against the holiness of God. This distinction is everything, and it is not subtle. When you measure yourself against other people, you will almost always be able to find someone who appears to be doing worse than you. Someone whose sin is more visible, whose struggles are more public, whose failures are more dramatic. And in finding that person, you feel the warm, comfortable glow of relative righteousness. You are not perfect, but you are better than that. The comparison becomes a sedative that quiets the more searching, more honest assessment. When you measure yourself against the holiness of God, the sedative stops working. You cannot stand before the blinding, comprehensive reality of divine holiness and feel comparatively adequate. Isaiah stood before the holiness of God in the temple, and his immediate response was not, "Well, at least I'm better than some people." His response was, "Woe to me! I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." The encounter with genuine holiness doesn't leave room for the Pharisee's comparative calculus. It reduces every one of us to the tax collector's posture, eyes down, chest aching, needing mercy more than we can articulate. Jesus says in Matthew 23 that those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. This is not merely a moral principle or a piece of practical wisdom about how social dynamics work. It is a description of how the economy of divine grace operates. Grace, by its very nature, flows downward. It flows toward the humble, toward the broken, toward those who have genuinely recognized their poverty and their need. Pride, by its very nature, creates the conditions in which grace cannot do its work, not because God withholds it in punishment, but because the posture of pride makes the soul incapable of receiving what is being offered. You cannot fill a vessel that is convinced it is already full. The Pharisee walked out of the temple exactly as he walked in, his spiritual condition unchanged, his relationship with God unmoved, his soul unaffected by the encounter. Not because God was not present, because he was not open. His pride had sealed him from the inside. The antidote to secret pride is not public self-flagellation or performative self-deprecation, which are, more often than we'd like to admit, just pride wearing a different costume. Inverted pride that is still fundamentally preoccupied with the self, still using the spiritual arena as a theater for self-presentation. The genuine antidote is what the contemplative tradition has long called the prayer of honest self-knowledge, the practice of sitting before God with no spiritual resume, no performance, no carefully curated presentation of your better qualities, and allowing yourself to simply be known, to bring in the full unadorned honesty of your actual interior life the 7 words of the tax collector. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Those 7 words, simple, short, unpolished, requiring no theological sophistication and no advanced spiritual development, are among the most powerful words in the history of prayer. They open every door that pride has quietly, incrementally, systematically closed. They are the beginning of a spiritual life that is actually alive, as opposed to one that is merely well-maintained. Sin 2, the sin of hardness of heart. In Mark chapter 3, we encounter a moment that reveals something essential about what Jesus found most grievous in the human soul. He is in the synagogue, the place of worship, of religious gathering, of ostensible devotion to God, and there is a man present with a shriveled hand. The religious leaders are watching Jesus, but not with the compassion that might be expected from people whose entire vocation is centered on God's mercy. They are watching with cold, calculating attention, waiting to see whether Jesus will heal on the Sabbath so that they can formulate an accusation against him. The text says that Jesus looked around at them, and then it says something that we should never read too quickly. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." Anger and deep distress, both simultaneously. Mark's Gospel characteristically gives us the rawest and most emotionally unfiltered account of this moment. Jesus is not merely irritated or disappointed or theologically troubled. He is grieved, genuinely, viscerally, deeply grieved. And the cause of his grief is not the man's disability. The man with the shriveled hand will be healed in moments. The cause of Jesus' grief is the spiritual condition of the people who are supposed to be the most devoted servants of God in that room, and yet cannot produce a single impulse of compassion for a suffering human being standing directly before them. Their hearts have become, in the precise Greek word Mark uses, petrified, literally turned to stone, hardened beyond the capacity for feeling, calcified against the movement of anything that does not serve their agenda. Hardness of heart is among the most frequently referenced spiritual conditions in all of Scripture, and this consistent emphasis is itself instructive. From the repeated hardening of Pharaoh's heart in Exodus to the ancient warnings of Psalm 95, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did at Meribah, as you did that day at Massah in the wilderness. To the alarm Jesus sounds throughout his ministry about souls that have become sealed against the transforming movement of God. This is clearly a condition of deep and recurring concern to the heart of God. How does a heart become hard? This is the question worth dwelling on, because the answer is almost never dramatic. Almost no one decides one morning to harden their heart. Almost no one makes a deliberate, conscious choice to become someone who cannot feel. The calcification is gradual, incremental. invisible to the person experiencing it precisely because it happens one small choice at a time. You choose not to respond to a prompting of conscience, just this once, just in this particular situation, with this particular justification. You choose to prioritize your comfort over another person's need, because engaging with that need would cost too much right now. You choose to look away from someone's suffering because you know that genuine compassion would require something of you that you are not currently willing to give. You choose to justify yourself rather than repent when confronted with evidence of your own failure, because repentance feels vulnerable and justification feels safe. Each of these individual choices seems, in the moment, relatively minor. A small adjustment, a reasonable accommodation, a perfectly understandable prioritization of your own needs and limits, but they accumulate. Over months and years, over the long trajectory of a life, they build up layer by layer. And one day, often without any single dramatic turning point you can identify, you realize that things which once moved you no longer do. The worship song that used to break something open in your chest now passes through you without leaving a mark. The scripture passage that once struck your heart with something like electricity now slides past you as a series of familiar words. The story of someone else's suffering, which once would have prompted genuine engagement, now produces a polite, appropriate-sounding response that has no real feeling behind it. The prayer that was once a living conversation has become a routine, a maintenance practice, a box to check before sleep. Jesus addresses this pattern explicitly in his extended explanation of the parable of the sower. He describes a heart like soil along a well-traveled path, hard-packed from constant traffic, impenetrable, unable to receive what falls on it. The seed of the word lands on the surface and is immediately snatched away, not because the person is hostile to it or has actively rejected it, but because the ground of their heart has been compacted by the steady pressure of life into a surface that nothing can penetrate. This is not a picture of someone who has made a dramatic decision to leave God. This is a picture of someone whose ongoing patterns of choice have gradually produced a condition in which they are no longer capable, in that moment, of genuinely receiving what God is attempting to give them. The most insidious aspect of hardness of heart is its self-concealing nature. A hard heart does not feel like a hard heart to the person who carries it. From the inside, it tends to feel like maturity, like the wisdom of someone who has moved past the emotional volatility of earlier seasons, who has learned not to be controlled by feelings, who has developed the sophisticated discernment to separate substance from sentiment. The person with a hard heart very often believes that their lack of tender responsiveness is actually evidence of spiritual depth rather than spiritual damage. They mistake petrification for stability. They mistake coldness for wisdom. They have lost something that was life itself, and they have constructed a story about why not having it makes them more developed, not less alive. The path back from hardness of heart, and there is always a path back, because this is one of the great mercies of God, that no heart is beyond the reach of his softening power, requires intentional, sustained exposure to the things that soften. Exposure to human suffering in genuine proximate relationship. Not suffering observed from a comfortable distance, not charitable engagement that keeps the suffering person at arm's length, but actual relationship with actual people who are actually hurting, which invariably costs something and disrupts your carefully managed life. Exposure to beauty, the kind of beauty that breaks open something inside you, that makes you gasp a little, that reminds you that the world is far larger and stranger and more wonderful than your settled categories allow. Exposure to honest prayer. Not the performative prayer of someone who has already decided how they feel and is communicating those predetermined feelings to God, but the wrestling prayer of someone who brings their actual interior life, including their numbness, their confusion, their uncertainty about whether anything is real, directly into the presence of God and refuses to pretend. And above all, exposure to the grace of God, not as a theological concept to be affirmed, not as a doctrinal position to be defended, but as a living, active reality that can be encountered in the full particularity of your actual life. When a person genuinely encounters grace, not the idea of grace, but the actual experience of being loved and held in the full knowledge of their worst, something happens to the stone inside them. The hard places crack, the sealed walls develop fractures, and through those fractures, slowly at first and then with increasing force, something begins to move. This is the miracle Ezekiel prophesied. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. That prophecy was not made to a culture that had the right theological categories. It was made to a people who had failed, who had hardened themselves, who had walked away from the living God in 1,000 incremental betrayals. And it was made as a promise of what God intends to do, what He is capable of doing, what He will do for everyone who is honest enough to admit that the stone is there. Sin 3, the sin of worry and anxious unbelief. Let us be careful here, because this sin requires the most careful handling of anything on our list. When Jesus identifies worry and anxiety as a spiritual condition requiring urgent attention, He is not dismissing the reality of psychological distress, not denying the role of biology and trauma and circumstance in producing states of anxious suffering that extend far beyond simple volitional choice. If you struggle with clinical anxiety, if your worry is rooted in something neurological or in wounds that go deep into your history, please hear the teaching of Jesus in this section through the lens of compassion for yourself, not condemnation. What Jesus is addressing in Matthew 6, in the most extended and detailed teaching on anxiety anywhere in the New Testament, is what we might call the theology of worry, the functional belief system that anxiety both reflects and reinforces. Because worry is never simply a feeling. It is a feeling that is downstream from a set of assumptions about how the world works and what God is like, and it is those assumptions that Jesus is most directly challenging. He says, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes?" He points to the birds of the air, who do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet the Heavenly Father feeds them. He invites attention to the wildflowers, how they grow without labor or spinning, and yet Solomon in all his glory was not clothed as magnificently as one of these. Then he asks a question that is simultaneously gentle and devastating in its precision. Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? The answer is self-evidently no. More than that, worry tends to subtract. It drains energy, corrupts sleep, narrows vision, poisons relationships, and produces physiological damage that medicine has been documenting for decades. Worry has never once solved the problem it was generated by. It has only generated more worry. But then Jesus says something that reveals the deepest diagnosis beneath the surface concern. For the pagans run after all these things, and your Heavenly Father knows that you need them. The word pagans here, sometimes translated Gentiles, is not primarily an ethnic designation. It describes people who orient their lives around the assumption that there is no divine care, no providential oversight, no Father who knows and tends to their needs. People for whom life is fundamentally a matter of securing your own position by your own effort, because there is no one watching, no one providing, no one who knows or cares. For such people, chronic anxiety makes a kind of terrible sense. You are alone in a system that does not care about you, and everything depends on what you can accumulate and control. Jesus says, that is not your situation. You have a Father who knows what you need before you ask. You live in a world that is not indifferent but watched over, and the practical daily implication of knowing that is supposed to be freedom from the compulsive, exhausting cycle of anxious control. When worry persists in the life of someone who confesses to believe all of this, what is actually happening is a split between stated theology and functional theology. Stated theology says, God knows, God provides, God is trustworthy, God is sovereign. Functional theology, the theology you actually live from, the theology demonstrated by the actual interior habits of your daily experience, says something quite different. It says, I cannot really trust this. I have to manage this. I have to ensure this. I have to hold this together because if I don't, it won't hold together, and the implications of that are too terrible to allow. That gap, the gap between what you say you believe about God and what your daily pattern of anxious living actually expresses, is what Jesus is calling attention to. Not to condemn, but to illuminate. Not to make you feel worse about yourself for worrying, but to help you see that the worry is pointing to something beneath itself that actually needs attention. A trust deficit, a functional unbelief, a part of your soul that has not yet been genuinely surrendered to the Father's care. But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. This is the alternative Jesus offers, and it is crucial to understand what it is and what it isn't. It is not a promise that if you focus on God, your practical needs will vanish, your financial pressures will evaporate, your health concerns will dissolve. Jesus did not promise His disciples a life of material comfort and ease. He promised them the opposite in many respects. What He is promising is a different relationship to the circumstances of life, a fundamentally reoriented posture that places the question of God's will and God's kingdom at the center of the daily attention, rather than the management of personal security. The person who lives from that posture, who has genuinely practically learned to bring their needs to God with the trust of a child rather than the anxiety of someone who believes they are ultimately alone, does not stop experiencing difficulty. They stop being controlled by it. They stop living in the future, in the catastrophic imagination of everything that might go wrong, and they become capable of inhabiting the actual present moment with something approaching peace. Paul describes this not as a doctrine, but as a learned practice in Philippians 4. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. The peace that comes from this practice is explicitly described as one that transcends understanding. It is not the peace of having figured everything out, of having resolved all uncertainty, of having secured all outcomes. It is a peace that coexists with unresolved uncertainty, that guards you within the uncertainty rather than removing it. Learning to live that way is a practice. It takes time, repetition, failure, and return. It requires the patient, persistent work of bringing your anxious thoughts to God again and again, not expecting them to vanish immediately, not condemning yourself when they return, but developing over time the habit of redirection, the muscle memory of trust that gradually replaces the muscle memory of anxious control. This is the work Jesus is inviting you into. It is slow, it is real, and it is genuinely transformative. Sin 4, the sin of an unforgiving heart. In Matthew 18, one of the disciples asks Jesus a question that appears on its surface to be about mathematics. Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? It is a generous offer by any cultural standard. In Jewish tradition, the number 7 carried associations of completeness, of fullness. The disciple is not being stingy. He is offering what he imagines to be a spiritually impressive maximum, a ceiling that goes significantly beyond what most people would consider obligatory. Jesus' answer dismantles the framework of the question entirely. I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Some manuscripts render this as 70 times 7, 490. The specific number does not matter. What matters is that Jesus is not negotiating within the disciples' framework of a ceiling. He is removing the framework of the ceiling itself. Forgiveness, in the economy of the kingdom, is not a finite resource that runs out after a certain number of applications and leaves you free from the obligation. It is not a performance you execute with gritted teeth until you reach the limit and can finally stop. It is a posture of the heart, a way of being in relationship with other people that is meant to become genuinely characteristic of who you are. The parable he tells immediately after makes this point with a force that is almost unbearable. A servant owes his king an astronomical amount, 10,000 talents. To give you a sense of scale, 1 talent was the equivalent of roughly 20 years of a laborer's wages. 10,000 talents would be hundreds of millions of dollars in contemporary terms. This is not a debt that is merely difficult to repay. It is a debt that is, by any conceivable calculation, impossible to repay in a single lifetime. The servant is about to lose everything, his freedom, his family, all of it, and he falls to his knees before the king and pleads for time. The king's response defies every expectation of economic rationality. He forgives the entire debt, not restructures it, not reduces it, cancels it completely. The servant walks away from that encounter with a freedom he did not earn and could not have earned in 100 lifetimes. Then, and this is where the story becomes almost suffocating, this same servant goes out and finds a fellow servant who owes him 100 denarii. 100 denarii is roughly the equivalent of a few months' wages, a real amount, not nothing, but small, beyond all comparison to the debt he has just had forgiven. He grabs his fellow servant by the throat. He demands immediate payment. The fellow servant falls to his knees, and here the parallel is deliberate and terrible, and uses almost identical words to those the forgiven servant himself had used before the king. He begs for time. He promises to repay. The forgiven servant refuses. He has the man thrown into prison until he can pay the debt. When the king hears about this, his response expresses not only justice, but something that reads like genuine heartbreak. You wicked servant! I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not also have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you? And Jesus closes this parable with words that constitute one of the most sobering warnings in all of his teaching. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. That last phrase, from your heart, is critical. Jesus is not describing a formal declaration of forgiveness, a verbal statement of release made with the mouth while the heart continues to harbor resentment. He is describing a genuine interior transformation, a real releasing of the debt at the level of the soul. The forgiveness he is calling for is not a performance. It is a reality. Why does Jesus return to this theme so persistently? Because he understands something about the nature of unforgiveness that we tend to profoundly underestimate. We carry our resentments as if they were weapons aimed at the people who hurt us, as if by withholding forgiveness we are maintaining pressure on them, keeping them accountable, ensuring they do not simply walk away from what they did without consequence. But the bitter reality of unforgiveness is that the weapon is aimed primarily at the person carrying it. The person who hurt you is in most cases living their life with very little daily awareness of the wound they caused. You are the one who carries it everywhere, into your sleep, into your relationships, into your prayers, into your body. The resentment you believe is wrapped around them is wrapped around you, and spiritually, the stakes are even higher. Jesus is explicit in Matthew 6, in the model prayer he gives his disciples, "Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors." This "as" is not decorative. It is structural. It describes a relationship between your capacity to receive forgiveness and your willingness to extend it that goes to the very architecture of the spiritual life. A heart that closes itself to giving forgiveness gradually, through the internal logic of its own posture, closes itself to receiving forgiveness as well, not because God withdraws the offer, but because the posture of a clenched, resentful, unforgiven heart makes it structurally incapable of opening to grace. You cannot extend your hands to receive with your fists clenched. Forgiveness, to be clear, is not pretending the harm did not happen. It is not excusing what was genuinely wrong. It is not the same as trust, which must be rebuilt over time and demonstrated behavior. It is not necessarily reconciliation with someone who remains dangerous or unchanged. It does not require the erasure of appropriate boundaries or the abandonment of legitimate protection. What forgiveness is, in the teaching of Jesus, is the releasing of your claim to hold the debt. It is the decision to stop maintaining the prison, to take the keys out of your own pocket, to unlock the door, and to trust God with the justice of what happened to you, rather than appointing yourself as judge and jailer. It is an act of surrender, and like all genuine surrender, it is simultaneously one of the most difficult things a human being can do, and one of the most profoundly liberating. The person who has genuinely forgiven a real injury, who has made the journey from resentment to release, not through cheap sentimentality, but through the hard, honest, painful work of choosing again and again to let it go, experiences a freedom that cannot be described from the outside. A weight lifts. Something that was consuming energy in the background of every day stops consuming it. Relationships that were being poisoned by the ambient radiation of unexpressed bitterness become capable again of genuine warmth, and the capacity to receive God's grace, which the resentment had been quietly blocking, opens again. Sin 5. The sin of empty religion. In Matthew 23, Jesus delivers what New Testament scholars call the 7 woes, a series of public declarations directed at the scribes and Pharisees that constitute the most sustained, the most pointed, and the most emotionally intense language he uses anywhere in the Gospels. He calls them hypocrites, repeatedly, relentlessly. He calls them blind guides. He says they are like whitewashed tombs, gleaming and beautiful on the exterior, full of dead bones and every kind of impurity within. He says they travel across land and sea to win a single convert, and then make that convert twice as much a child of destruction as themselves. He calls them snakes and a brood of vipers. These are not mild words. Even reading them 2,000 years later in translation, they carry a weight and an urgency that is hard to sit with comfortably. But it is important to recognize what is behind them, because the intensity of Jesus' language here is not the cold intensity of a judge pronouncing sentence. It is the anguished intensity of someone who loves deeply and is watching something precious being destroyed. He is looking at a tradition, a covenant, an entire way of life that was designed to be the living vehicle of God's presence and God's character in the world. And he is watching it be hollowed out into performance, into a theater of external compliance with no interior reality, into a system of visible devotion that has lost all connection to the living God it was originally designed to express. The core accusation that threads through every one of the 7 woes is essentially the same. You have made the outward form everything and the inward reality nothing. You tithe with extraordinary precision even on the smallest herbs from your garden, mint, dill, cumin, because tithing is visible and auditable and publicly measurable. But you have neglected justice, mercy, and faithfulness, the interior qualities of the heart that the entire structure of the law was always meant to cultivate, without which the external observance is like an elaborate and beautifully constructed shell with nothing alive inside it. You clean the outside of the cup with great diligence, while the inside is full of greed and self-indulgence. You build beautiful tombs for the prophets, while the same prophetic spirit, if it appeared in your generation, would receive from you exactly what it received in theirs. Empty religion is, in many ways, the most insidious of all the silent sins on this list, because it is the most perfectly camouflaged. The person living inside empty religion does not experience themselves as practicing a hollow faith. They experience themselves as practicing faith. The behaviors are all present. The vocabulary is fluent, the participation is regular and visible, the reputation within the community is sound, perhaps even exemplary, and because the external behaviors are genuinely the right behaviors, Bible reading is good, church attendance is good, tithing is good, serving in ministry is good. It is extraordinarily easy to mistake the ongoing performance of these behaviors for the living spiritual reality they are supposed to express. The diagnostic question, the question that cuts through the performance to the reality beneath, is what happens when no one is watching. Not what you do differently when no one is watching, though that is certainly relevant, but what happens to the quality of the experience itself when the audience is removed. Is your prayer life genuinely alive in private? Are there moments in your private prayer when something real happens, when genuine communication occurs between your soul and God? Or has it become a maintenance practice you perform because it is part of the identity structure of being a serious Christian? When you read Scripture in private, are you genuinely encountered by it, genuinely surprised by it, genuinely challenged and comforted and reoriented by what you find there? Or have you mastered the sophisticated skill of reading the Bible without being read by it, absorbing the familiar words into an interpretive framework that has been constructed so thoroughly that nothing in the text can genuinely disturb it? When you serve in ministry, when you volunteer, when you lead, when you teach, is there a quality of genuine giving in it? A real expenditure of yourself for something beyond yourself, a joy that comes from encountering God in the act of serving? Or has it become something you do primarily because it confirms a certain image you hold of yourself, because it keeps you at the center of a community that gives you identity and belonging, because stopping would require you to confront questions about your spiritual life that you'd prefer not to confront? These are not comfortable questions. They are not meant to be. But they are the questions that Jesus is asking in Matthew 23, and they are questions that every person of genuine faith must be willing to apply honestly to their own interior life. Jesus says in John 4 that the Father is seeking worshippers who worship in spirit and in truth, not in form and tradition, not in performance and reputation. In spirit, with the genuine engagement of the actual soul, with real interior participation rather than external execution. And in truth, with honesty, with authenticity, without the mask, that religion of all things has a peculiar and tragic capacity to become. God is not impressed by the mask. He has always seen behind it. What he is seeking is the face beneath it. The invitation here is extraordinarily gentle despite the sternness of Jesus' words in Matthew 23. He is not condemning people for whom the external forms have become hollow, as if they were villains. He is calling out a condition with the urgency of a physician who has diagnosed something genuinely dangerous. And the path back is not complicated. It is simply a return to honesty, a willingness to say to God, the forms are still there, but I'm not sure the reality is. I'm not sure I feel you anymore. I'm not sure my prayers are landing anywhere. Help me. Not the prayers of someone who has it together, but the prayers of someone who wants it to be real again, more than they want to maintain the appearance of having it together. That prayer, honest, vulnerable, unimpressive, is the beginning of the return. Sin 6, the sin of loving the world's approval. How can you believe, Jesus asks in John 5:44, since you accept glory from one another, but do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? It is one of those questions in the Gospels that stops the careful reader cold. Not because it is rhetorical in the dismissive sense, not because Jesus is expressing contempt for the people he is addressing, but because it identifies a structural mechanism, a logical incompatibility, that makes the simultaneous pursuit of two different forms of approval not merely difficult, but functionally impossible. You cannot believe. You cannot exercise the open, surrendered, trusting orientation toward God that the word faith describes, while your fundamental orientation is toward securing and maintaining the approval of the people around you. The two orientations are not merely in tension, they operate in opposite directions. Faith requires a willingness to go where God leads, regardless of social cost. The pursuit of human approval requires a willingness to stay where approval is available, regardless of where God is leading. At every significant decision point, every place where following Jesus honestly would produce social friction, would challenge comfortable group consensus, would require you to say something true that people do not want to hear, or to do something faithful that people will misunderstand. The orientation toward human approval and the orientation toward divine faithfulness will pull you in different directions, and only one of them can win. Jesus addresses this with particular clarity in Matthew 6, in 3 consecutive illustrations that form the practical heart of his extended teaching on the secret life. He addresses giving, prayer, and fasting, 3 of the most central practices of Jewish religious devotion, and in each case he identifies the same structural problem. People who perform these practices in ways designed to be seen and admired by human observers. He says they have received their reward, the admiration of those who see them, and there is no additional, deeper reward available on top of it. They have made a transaction, the interior work of genuine spiritual practice in exchange for exterior recognition, and the transaction is final. The admiration is the reward. It is the only reward, and it is, by the standards of eternity, an extraordinarily poor exchange. The love of human approval is especially dangerous in the context of faith because it creates a fundamental inauthenticity in the spiritual life. The person who is primarily managing how their faith looks to others cannot genuinely follow Jesus wherever he leads, because genuine discipleship is not always socially profitable. There are inevitably moments in the life of every genuine disciple when following Jesus requires saying something uncomfortable, challenging an assumption that everyone in the room shares, refusing to participate in something that the social group regards as normal and acceptable. Standing in a place where the majority is not standing. The person who is primarily concerned with the approval of the majority cannot stand in those places. The love of approval functions as a leash, allowing movement in every direction that social consensus accepts, and pulling tight the moment genuine conscience would lead somewhere that social consensus doesn't. John 12:42-43 contains what is, to my mind, one of the most heartbreaking observations in the entire gospel narrative. Many of the rulers, the religious and social authorities, the educated, the influential, the people with the most to gain and the most to lose, believed in Jesus. They had seen enough, heard enough, to be genuinely convinced. But they would not confess it openly. And the reason John gives is deceptively simple. For they loved human praise more than praise from God. They had enough light to see the truth. They simply did not have enough freedom from the approval of their peers to act on what they saw. The love of human glory functioned as a ceiling. It allowed them to go so far in following the light, and then, at the point where following the light would cost them their social standing, their reputation, their belonging in the community of the powerful, it held them back. They remained secretly convinced, quietly believing, thoroughly compromised, never publicly free. This is not a problem that has aged. It is a problem that has, if anything, intensified in an era of social media, of public reputation management, of the constant, low-grade anxiety produced by living life in a space where everyone's opinion of you is potentially visible and quantifiable. The hunger for approval has always been woven into human psychology. We are social creatures, and the desire to belong and to be well regarded by those around us is not in itself pathological. The problem is the degree to which this desire grows until it begins to override the capacity for honest spiritual life, until the management of reputation becomes the organizing principle of decisions rather than the actual content of conscience and conviction. How much of your spiritual life is, if you are genuinely honest, shaped by what other people will think? How many conversations about faith have you avoided because they would have been awkward or unpopular? How many times have you softened a truth you knew to be true because the full version of it would have cost you something socially? How many times have you remained silent in situations where genuine love would have required you to speak? These are not rhetorical accusations. They are questions that anyone who takes their spiritual life seriously must sit with regularly, because the erosion of genuine conviction under the steady, gentle, persistent pressure of social approval seeking is one of the most common and least discussed ways that real faith quietly dies. Paul's answer to this dynamic is one of the most clarifying statements in all of his letters. Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. This is not arrogance. It is not a contemptuous dismissal of other people's perspectives or a license for the kind of self-righteous contrarianism that mistakes being difficult for being prophetic. It is a statement of settled identity, a description of a person who has found their fundamental security and belovedness in God, rather than in the shifting, unstable, endlessly demanding verdicts of human opinion. The freedom that comes from that settled identity, the freedom to follow wherever Jesus leads without checking first whether the destination will look acceptable, is one of the most transformative spiritual realities available to a human being. It is also one of the most costly to achieve because it requires the sustained, often painful process of loosening the grip of the approval of people who matter to you in favor of the approval of the God you cannot see. That process is the work of a lifetime, but it begins with the honest acknowledgement that the approval of people has been doing work in your life that it was never meant to do. Sin 7, the sin of spiritual complacency. In Matthew 25, Jesus tells a story that is deeply embedded in the culture of wedding celebration in ancient Palestine, but whose spiritual application could not be more contemporary or more urgent. 10 young women are waiting for the bridegroom to arrive for the wedding feast. They all have lamps. They are all in attendance, all part of the waiting company, all bearing the visible sign of participation in the celebration. 5 of them have brought containers of extra oil along with their lamps. 5 have not. The bridegroom is delayed. The delay is longer than expected, longer than comfortable, longer than the group had planned for. And in the middle of the extended wait, they all fall asleep. This is important. Not 5 of them fall asleep. All 10 fall asleep. Jesus does not present the foolish virgins as uniquely culpable for sleeping. Sleep came for all of them in the long delay, as sleep tends to come. When the cry goes up at midnight that the bridegroom is arriving, all 10 wake. They all begin trimming their lamps, but in 5 of the lamps, the oil has run out, and there is no reservoir, no extra supply, nothing to sustain the flame through the extended waiting period that none of them had adequately prepared for. The wise bring oil from the foolish go to buy more, and when they return, the door is shut. The feast has begun without them. The most theologically striking detail in this parable, when you sit with it, is the one I mentioned. They all slept. The distinction between the wise and the foolish is not a distinction between those who maintained vigilant wakefulness and those who failed. It is a distinction between those who had, in the quieter seasons before the crisis, done the necessary work of sustaining their interior resources, who had maintained the disciplines and practices and relationships with God that ensure the flame continues to burn even through extended periods of waiting, difficulty, and ordinary life, and those who had not. The wise women's preparation was not dramatic. It was unglamorous. It was the quiet, daily, unimpressive work of maintaining something when there is no immediate urgency to do so. Spiritual complacency is the condition of a soul that is formally present but not actually prepared. It is the faith that burned brightly in the early seasons, in the fresh enthusiasm of new belief, in the warmth of a revival, in the urgency of a crisis that drove the person to their knees and made the reality of God undeniable, but has not been sustained through the long, ordinary, unglamorous middle of the Christian life. It is not apostasy, it is not rebellion. It is not the dramatic departure of someone who has consciously rejected God. It is something quieter and in some ways more difficult to address. The slow settling over months and years into a spiritual life that has enough of the form to feel like faith but has gradually lost the interior fire that makes the form meaningful. Jesus addresses this pattern repeatedly and with genuine alarm throughout his teaching. In the parable of the talents, the servant who is condemned is not the one who did something dramatically wicked with what he was entrusted. He buried it. He preserved it safely. He returned exactly what was given to him, with nothing lost, but also with nothing gained. He chose the safety of passivity over the risk of active faithfulness. And it is precisely this choice, the choice of preservation over investment, of safety over surrender, of keeping things exactly as they are, because that is easier than engaging with where God might be leading. That draws the judgment of his master. The letter to the church at Laodicea in Revelation 3, words attributed to the risen Christ by the Apostle John in his vision, delivers what is perhaps the most viscerally unforgettable verdict on spiritual complacency in all of Scripture. You are neither cold nor hot. I wish you were either one or the other. So because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I am about to spit you out of my mouth. The image is deliberately physical, deliberately repulsive, chosen for maximum impact. The risen Christ is not indifferent to Laodicea's spiritual condition. He is nauseated by it, not by their sin, by their tepidness. By the comprehensive, settled, comfortable mediocrity of a faith that has accommodated itself so thoroughly to the surrounding culture that it has lost all its distinctive heat, all its transforming temperature, all the qualities that make it something more than a slightly spiritual version of ordinary life. What makes complacency a silent sin is precisely its silence, the absence of anything obviously wrong. The complacent person has not done anything dramatically terrible. They have not committed any spectacular failures. They attend services, they maintain behaviors, they retain the vocabulary and the identity. But the life has quietly gone out. The fire that was once real has been reduced to embers. And then the embers have been covered over by the ash of routine, of familiarity, of a faith that has been domesticated into something that never asks anything costly or surprising anymore. And they have become so accustomed to the warmth of the embers that they have stopped noticing the difference between embers and fire. The corrective Jesus points toward in his message to Laodicea is a word that seems almost too simple. Remember, therefore, from where you have fallen. Repent and do the works you did at first. Remember, return. The journey back from complacency is not a matter of manufacturing artificial enthusiasm or forcing yourself into spiritual experiences you don't genuinely feel. It is the honest, humble practice of going back to the beginning, of returning to the place where the fire was real, to the disciplines and relationships and encounters with God that were genuinely alive, and asking with honest attention what happened between there and here. When did I start settling? When did faith stop being an adventure and become a routine? What was the moment or the series of moments when I stopped pressing in and then beginning slowly and without drama to press in again? Sin 8, the sin of greed and the idolatry of money. You cannot serve both God and money. Addie, this statement from Matthew 6:24 is one of the most direct, most unambiguous, most unhedged declarations Jesus makes anywhere in the gospel record, and it is also perhaps the most consistently underweighted in the life of the contemporary church. We have become skilled in many church cultures at treating questions about wealth and material attachment as practical rather than spiritual, as matters of financial wisdom and responsible stewardship, rather than as the central spiritual battleground Jesus consistently identifies them to be. We give people budgeting advice when Jesus is issuing a warning about the state of their souls. The word Jesus uses, translated money in most contemporary versions, rendered mammon in older translations, is not a neutral term for currency. It carries the connotation of something that has been entrusted, something accumulated, something relied upon. It is not the problem of having money. Jesus' closest supporters included people of means who supported his ministry. It is the problem of a relationship to money that gives it the qualities that belong to God: ultimate trust, fundamental identity, the source of security and significance, the thing that is loved and pursued and protected above all else. Jesus says this is structurally incompatible with serving God. Not difficult, not challenging, incompatible. You cannot do both. Because the posture that genuine service of God requires, open hands, surrendered will, fundamental trust in divine provision rather than accumulated security, is directly opposed to the posture that the idolatry of money requires. Closed hands, controlled future, fundamental trust in what you own and can therefore control. In Luke 12:15, he prefaces one of his most pointed teachings with a warning that sounds like something you would say to a person about to step into a road without looking. Watch out! Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. The urgency of the language is intentional, all kinds, not just the obvious, aggressive, trampling others for profit kind, but the subtle, respectable, eminently justifiable kinds, the kind dressed as prudence, the kind dressed as providing for your family, the kind dressed as being responsible, all kinds. He then tells a story about a man who, by every conventional measure, has had remarkable success. His land has produced abundantly, so abundantly that his existing storage is insufficient. He makes the entirely rational decision to build larger storage, to preserve his harvest, to secure his future. And then he says something to himself in the privacy of his own interior dialogue that reveals the absolute poverty of his soul behind the abundance of his possessions. Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. He is speaking to his soul as if accumulated goods were soul food, as if what the deepest, most real part of him required for genuine flourishing was a full storehouse and a comfortable future. As if the needs of the soul could be addressed by the arrangements of the bank account, and God's response, direct, immediate, devastating, strips away every illusion in a single sentence. You fool, this very night your soul is demanded from you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? What makes this man a fool in the divine assessment is not his work ethic. He presumably worked hard to produce what he produced. It is not his success. God is not suspicious of success. It is the narrowness of the world he inhabits, a world in which there is no dimension beyond the material, no reality beyond what can be stored and measured and relied upon. He is a man with a full barn and an empty soul, and he does not know it. And Jesus is telling us that not knowing it is the most dangerous possible condition. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. This is one of those observations from the Sermon on the Mount that is so compact and so accurate that it repays extended meditation. Jesus is not telling you to rearrange your heart and then your treasure will follow. He is telling you that hearts follow treasure. This is how hearts work. The thing you invest in with your actual resources, your money, your time, your focused attention and energy, is the thing your heart grows toward. Investment creates attachment. Attachment shapes love. Love shapes the soul. So the question of what you are investing in is not merely a financial question, it is a soul question. It is the question of what you are becoming, what kind of person you are forming yourself into through the daily, practical, unchosen seeming decisions about what gets your money and what gets your time and what gets the center of your attention and energy. The rich young ruler of Matthew 19 is perhaps the most poignant illustration of what is at stake here. He comes to Jesus genuinely, urgently, not as a skeptic looking for an argument, but as a sincere seeker, genuinely asking what he must do to inherit eternal life. He has kept the commandments. He is not a corrupt person. Mark tells us that when Jesus looked at him, he loved him. Genuinely, specifically, this particular young man with his genuine seeking and his genuine struggle. And then Jesus says, the one thing this particular young man cannot hear, go and sell what you have, give to the poor, come and follow me. The young man goes away grieving, not angry, not defensive, grieving because he has great wealth, and because at the moment of decision, at the place where he is forced to choose between his wealth and following Jesus, he finds that he cannot do it. He has everything except freedom, and he walks away from the very thing he came to find. The question Jesus places before every person who hears this story is not whether we are as wealthy as the rich young ruler. It is whether there is anything at all, that we would turn away from Jesus to keep. Sin 9, the sin of judgmentalism. Matthew 7:1. Do not judge, or you too will be judged, is almost certainly the most frequently quoted sentence from the Sermon on the Mount in contemporary Western culture. And it is, with equal certainty, almost always misunderstood. It is deployed most commonly as a conversation-ending rebuttal, a way of shutting down moral assessment or ethical evaluation. You're not supposed to judge. Jesus said so. But this interpretation, however convenient, does not survive honest engagement with the context. A few verses after issuing this warning, Jesus instructs his disciples to watch out for false prophets, to assess them by their fruits, to evaluate claims to spiritual authority against the evidence of their lives. He describes some people as dogs and some things as pearls, which implies the capacity to distinguish between them. He uses moral categories and requires moral discernment throughout the Sermon on the Mount. He is clearly not teaching that moral evaluation is impermissible, What he is warning against is judgmentalism, a word worth distinguishing carefully from judgment. Judgment, in the constructive sense, is the necessary moral discernment that allows a person to navigate the world honestly, to recognize genuine goodness and genuine danger, to hold appropriate expectations of themselves and others, to engage with ethical reality rather than retreating into a blanket relativism that pretends everything is equally acceptable. Judgmentalism is something different. It is the habitual, comprehensive, characteristic posture of critical superiority toward others, the orientation that is constantly scanning for failure and fault in the people around you, that finds its primary psychological sustenance in the identification and cataloguing of other people's shortcomings, that has elevated its own moral perspective into a throne from which it pronounces verdicts on everyone within range. Jesus illustrates the distinction with an image that is both comic and devastating. You are, he says, attempting to remove a speck of sawdust from your brother's eye while you yourself have a plank, a full beam of wood, protruding from your own. The image is deliberately excessive, deliberately absurd, to make the point unforgettable. The person who is preoccupied with the moral failures of others is operating under a perceptual distortion so severe that they cannot see their own condition clearly. And the reason they are so intensely focused on others' failures is, Jesus implies, precisely because maintaining that focus allows them to avoid the more searching, more costly examination of their own interior life. Judgmentalism is always, at its core, a mechanism of self-protection. If my attention is primarily directed at your failures, I do not have to look at mine. If I can maintain a clear and comfortable hierarchy in which you are obviously below me, spiritually, morally, in terms of faithful living, then I do not have to sit with the more uncomfortable recognition of my own inadequacy before the genuine standard of God's holiness. The person who is most vocally critical of others is reliably the person most invested in avoiding honest self-assessment. Jesus says, "For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." This is not primarily a threat about divine judgment, though it includes that dimension. It is a description of the spiritual law of reciprocity. What you habitually offer to others is what you habitually create in the world around you and within yourself. A heart oriented toward mercy encounters mercy everywhere, in God, in others, in itself. A heart oriented toward condemnation creates a world saturated in condemnation, an interior climate of harsh assessment from which there is no escape, because you cannot ultimately apply to yourself a different standard than the one you insist on applying to everyone else. The measuring stick you use on others is the measuring stick that measures you, and in using it constantly on others, you have guaranteed that it will find you wanting. Paul's expansion of this theme in Romans 2 is one of the most uncomfortable passages in his entire corpus. You, therefore, have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else, for at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. The things we judge most harshly and most persistently in others are, with consistent and humbling regularity, the things that are operating most powerfully in ourselves. Just in different forms, under different names, in circumstances that our personality type or social position or life narrative has made less visible to observers and perhaps even to ourselves. The antidote to judgmentalism is not the abandonment of moral clarity. A world without moral clarity is not a kinder world. It is a more dangerous one. The antidote is the cultivation of what Paul calls a spirit of gentleness, the posture of someone who approaches the failures and struggles of others with genuine awareness of their own fragility, their own ongoing need for grace, their own ongoing dependence on mercy they have not earned and cannot sustain by effort. Brothers and sisters, Paul writes in Galatians 6:1, "If someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently, but watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted." The caution is embedded in the instruction. The person who goes to address someone else's failure in a spirit of genuine humility does so knowing they are equally capable of failure, and that awareness transforms the encounter from verdict to companionship. Sin 10. The sin of deliberate hypocrisy. We have already explored the territory of empty religion, the condition of a faith that maintains the external forms while losing the interior reality. Deliberate hypocrisy is something that overlaps with that, but is worth distinguishing as its own category because it involves an element that empty religion does not necessarily include: conscious awareness of the gap. The person living in empty religion may have genuinely lost touch with the reality of what is missing. The person engaged in deliberate hypocrisy knows the gap is there. They are, on some level of awareness, choosing to maintain a presentation they know to be false because the presentation is serving important functions, social, professional, psychological, that they are not willing to surrender. In Luke 12:1, Jesus turns to his disciples in the middle of an enormous crowd, thousands of people pressing in so closely that they are stepping on one another. And he identifies the thing he most urgently needs them to understand at that moment. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Yeast is such a precise and illuminating metaphor for this condition. You cannot see yeast working. It is invisible in the mixture. It does not announce itself. But it is genuinely working, genuinely active, genuinely transformative, and over time, it changes the entire nature of the substance it has entered. A small amount of yeast, working quietly and invisibly, transforms a whole batch of dough. A small initial compromise between your public presentation and your private reality, working quietly and invisibly through the entire structure of your interior life, transforms you, slowly, steadily, without dramatic markers, into a person who has lost the ability to be genuine even when they want to be. Jesus goes on to make an observation that is both a warning and, in a strange way, a mercy. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, and what you have whispered in the ear in the inner rooms will be proclaimed from the roofs. The universe is not structured to permanently sustain inauthenticity. Reality ultimately and inevitably surfaces. The gap between the public self and the private self is not a stable condition. It is an inherently unstable one that requires ever-increasing expenditure of energy to maintain. The maintenance of a performance is exhausting in ways that are not always consciously felt, but are always actually born. And over time, the weight of maintaining the gap grows until something gives. What deliberate hypocrisy does, at the deepest level, is the thing that should matter most to anyone who genuinely wants to know God. It makes genuine encounter with God effectively impossible. Genuine encounter with God requires honesty, the willingness to be actually known rather than performing being known, the willingness to bring the real interior life into the presence of the living God, rather than offering God the same carefully managed presentation that you offer everyone else. The God who is truth, who, as David says in Psalm 51, desires truth in the inward parts, is not available at the level of presentation. He inhabits the level of reality. The person who has maintained a hypocritical performance for years finds, increasingly, that their prayer feels like a performance even in private, that scripture reading produces no genuine encounter, because the protective shell of the maintained persona has extended even into that space. That worship is something they watch themselves doing rather than something they genuinely participate in. The mask worn long enough, becomes the face, or at least becomes so thoroughly fused with the face that the person can no longer easily tell where one ends and the other begins. This is the fullness of the yeast's work. This is what Jesus is warning about. The only exit from this condition is the act of courage that may feel most impossible to the person who needs it most. Dropping the mask. Beginning in private, in the absolute privacy of honest prayer, in the confession that no one else hears, in the willingness to bring the actual self, not the spiritual persona, into the presence of God and remain there without performing. And then, in appropriate measure, with appropriate wisdom and safety, beginning to allow the real person to be seen by at least some of the people in their life. This is terrifying. The person who has built their standing, religious, social, professional, on a presentation knows at some level that the presentation is what people are responding to, and fears that without it, there will be nothing left worth responding to. But the alternative, the continuation of building a life on a foundation that you yourself know is not real, is the surest possible path to the catastrophe Jesus describes in his parable of the two builders. The house on sand can look impressive for a long time. It is only in the storm that the foundation's inadequacy becomes undeniable. Sin 11, the sin of neglecting the poor and the vulnerable. In Matthew 25, Jesus delivers what may be the most searching vision of judgment in all of Scripture. And it is remarkable when you sit with it for what it emphasizes and what it does not. There is no mention in this scene of correct doctrinal belief. There is no examination of church attendance or tithing records or ministry involvement. There is no assessment of biblical knowledge or theological precision or liturgical correctness. The criterion that the king applies consistently and without exception to both groups assembled before him is this: what did you do when you encountered the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, the imprisoned? For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. And conversely, to those on his left, the inverse of each. I was hungry, and you gave me nothing. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. The response of both groups is identical in its structure. When did we see you? Neither the sheep nor the goats remember seeing the king in the encounters in question, because in neither case were the encounters experienced as encounters with the king. The sheep helped the hungry and thirsty and imprisoned simply because they were hungry and thirsty and imprisoned. They did not do it as a spiritual practice, as a ministry program, as a calculated act of devotion. They did it because it was what they had become, people whose encounter with the love and mercy of God had made them naturally, instinctively, habitually responsive to the needs of the people around them. And the goats walked past, not because they were dramatically wicked people, not because they had consciously decided to refuse the king. Simply because their hearts had not been formed into the shape that sees need and responds to it, because the encounter with grace had not produced in them the particular sensitivity, the characteristic attentiveness to human suffering that is the organic fruit of genuine faith. This is one of the most important passages in the entire gospel for understanding what Jesus means when he talks about the soul. The soul is not a spiritual compartment that exists in isolation from the practical arrangements of everyday life. The soul is the whole person in their entirety, the person you are becoming through the accumulated choices of your daily life, including the choices about who you see and who you walk past, about where your money goes and where it doesn't, about what claims on your time and energy you respond to, and what claims you find it convenient not to notice. The sin of neglecting the poor and vulnerable is, as I said at the outset, a sin of omission rather than commission. You do not have to do anything actively terrible to be guilty of it. You simply have to not see, or more accurately, to allow the comfortable machinery of inattention to operate undisturbed. You have to continue structuring your life around your own comfort and convenience and social context in ways that keep the genuinely suffering people of the world at a distance that does not require anything of you. You have to let the abstract compassion you feel at a news story substitute for the concrete engagement that genuine love requires. You have to let a charitable donation, generous, well-intentioned, genuinely good, become the thing that purchases you the right to not be in actual relationship with actual people whose poverty and suffering would, if you allowed them to genuinely register, cost you something far more disruptive than money. The parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10 is so familiar that it has lost for many people the sharpness of its original cutting edge. But consider what Jesus is actually depicting. The priest and the Levite, the religious professionals, the men whose entire lives are organized around devotion to God and service to the community, pass by a man who has been beaten and left for dead. They see him. They make a conscious decision about what to do with what they see, and they go to the other side of the road. Jesus does not portray them as villains. He portrays them as people who, in a moment of genuine choice, prioritized the comfort, the cleanliness, the uninterrupted continuity of their religious lives over the claim that a suffering human being made on them. They were on their way somewhere that mattered. They had responsibilities and obligations. And the man in the road was a mess, bloody, contaminated, requiring more than a quick acknowledgement, requiring genuine time and genuine sacrifice and genuine disruption of their carefully organized day. The Samaritan, the outsider, the one with no social or religious standing, the one who, by every cultural expectation, should have been the least likely candidate for heroism in this story, stops. He is moved by compassion. The Greek word is one that describes a physical, visceral response, something happening in the gut, not just the head. And from that visceral response flows everything else: the bandaging, the transportation, the accommodation, the financial provision, the commitment to return. Not a careful, calibrated, professionally appropriate response. The full response of a person who has allowed another person's suffering to genuinely register. James, the brother of Jesus, states the implication with such directness that it leaves no room for theological escape. Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm and well fed," but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? The words of blessing without the action of care are not a reduced version of genuine faith. They are evidence of an absence of faith, of a faith that is, as James says without apology, dead. This does not mean that every follower of Jesus must engage with poverty and suffering in the same way or to the same degree. It does not mean that every form of ministry is equivalent or that organized distance is always wrong. It does mean that genuine faith, genuinely encountered and genuinely alive, produces a characteristic sensitivity to human need and a characteristic willingness to respond, that the question of what you do with the suffering people around you is not a peripheral question about social conscience, but a central question about whether the love of God is actually at work in you. Sin 12. The sin of refusing to come to the light. We have arrived at the final sin on this list, and it is, in the most profound sense, the one that makes all the others possible. It is the condition that allows every other silent sin to remain silent, to stay unnamed, unexamined, unconfessed, and therefore beyond the reach of the grace that could heal it. And Jesus identifies it with extraordinary clarity in John 3, in one of the most theologically rich passages in the entire Gospel. He has been in conversation with Nicodemus, the Pharisee, the teacher of Israel, the man who comes at night in secret because he is drawn to Jesus but cannot afford to be seen being drawn to Jesus. Jesus speaks to him about the new birth, about the Spirit, about the love of God for the world. And then he says this, "And this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his work should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God." The light has come. Jesus is describing his own presence in the world as the arrival of light into a place that has been, in profound ways, dark. And he is identifying the fundamental human response to that light, not the dramatic response, not the explicitly hostile response, not the response of people who know themselves to be in opposition to God and have made their peace with that. He is identifying the quiet, everyday, eminently respectable, thoroughly ordinary human response, the preference for darkness, not the love of evil for its own sake. The love of the shadow in which the parts of yourself that you are not ready to examine can remain comfortably unexamined, in which the sins that have become familiar companions can stay familiar without being forced into the naming light. This is, at its deepest level, the refusal of honesty with God and with yourself. It is the refusal to allow the light of divine truth to shine into the corners that you know. Some part of you knows, some part always knows, contain things that need to be seen. It is the sophisticated self-deception that has been so practiced and so polished and so carefully maintained over so many years that it no longer feels like self-deception from the inside. It feels like self-knowledge. It feels like an accurate assessment of your own spiritual condition, an honest accounting of where you are and where you've been. And what you have actually done is build a mental architecture so sophisticated in its avoidances, so skilled in its redirections, so practiced in its justifications, that genuine self-knowledge has been effectively blocked. This is the sin that underpins every other sin on this list. Think about it carefully. Secret pride can only remain secret if you never allow yourself to genuinely see it, if you never bring the interior of your comparative, self-congratulatory prayer into honest examination. Hardness of heart can only continue to harden if you never bring it into contact with the exposure and vulnerability that softens. Anxious unbelief can only keep its hold if you never honestly name the functional theology that your daily pattern of worry expresses. An unforgiving heart can only persist if you never honestly examine the wound it is protecting and the cost it is exacting. Empty religion can only be maintained if you never allow yourself to feel the emptiness. Never sit still long enough in honest enough silence to notice that the living God is not present in your religious activity the way he once was. The love of approval can only dominate your life if you never honestly admit how much of your spiritual behavior is performance rather than reality. Complacency can only deepen if you never apply genuine, honest assessment to the distance between the fire you once had and the lukewarm state you have settled for. Greed can only function as a functional idol if you never allow yourself to honestly examine what you trust, what you're genuinely afraid of losing, where your deepest security actually resides. Judgmentalism can only continue if you never apply to yourself the standard you apply so freely to everyone around you. Deliberate hypocrisy can only be sustained if you never drop the mask, even in private, even with God. And the neglect of the poor and vulnerable can only continue if you never allow the faces of the people who are suffering around you to genuinely penetrate the comfortable insulation of your carefully managed life. Every one of these conditions is maintained by the refusal to come to the light, and every one of them begins to be healed the moment you bring them there. Whoever does what is true, Jesus says, comes to the light. Does what is true, the phrase is remarkable. Truth in the teaching of Jesus is not only a category of accurate proposition, it is a quality of living, a practice of being, an orientation of the whole person toward reality rather than toward the comfortable fiction you prefer. The person who does what is true comes to the light because they have made the ongoing choice, the practiced daily costly choice, to be honest rather than comfortable, to bring their actual self with their actual condition into the actual presence of the actual God, and to remain there in the exposure, trusting that the light that reveals is also the light that heals. Because this is the grace that makes the entire invitation possible. The light that exposes every hidden thing is not the light of condemnation. Jesus has already said it clearly. He did not come to condemn the world, but to save it. He is the light that allows you to see, not so that what you see can destroy you, but so that it can be surrendered and healed and transformed. The God who sees everything the light reveals, who has always seen it, who knew it before you did, is not waiting to punish you for what comes to light. He is waiting to heal it. He has been waiting with patience that is beyond what we can comfortably imagine, for the soul to stop running, to turn around, to step out of the shadow and into the place where genuine life and genuine transformation and genuine encounter with the living God are possible. Come to the light. Stop protecting the shadow. Stop maintaining the careful distances. Stop performing adequacy you don't feel and righteousness you haven't yet achieved. Come as you are, with the pride, with the hard heart, with the worry and the unforgiveness, and the empty routines and the approval-seeking and the complacency and the attachment to things that are not God, and the judgmental posture and the mask and the closed eyes and the distance from the suffering people at your door. Come as you are. That is the invitation that Jesus has been extending for 2,000 years, through every generation and culture and language and circumstance, to every person who has enough honest awareness to know that they are not yet where they want to be, not yet who they were made to be, not yet fully at home in the love that has been waiting for them. Come to the light and let it do what it has always been trying to do. Conclusion. The courage to be honestly known. We have walked slowly and carefully through 12 conditions of the soul that Jesus identified in his ministry as among the most dangerous. Dangerous precisely because of their silence, their capacity for camouflage, their ability to persist undetected while doing deep and lasting damage to the interior life. We have sat with pride and hardness of heart, with anxious unbelief and the prison of unforgiveness, with the hollow form of empty religion and the tyranny of human approval, with the slow death of complacency and the idolatry of wealth, with judgmentalism and deliberate hypocrisy, with the closed eyes that walk past suffering and the closed heart that refuses to come into the light. And we have done all of this not in a spirit of condemnation, because that spirit is one that Jesus himself refused to inhabit. He came, he said, not to judge the world, but to save it. He came not to stand at a distance and pronounce verdicts, but to enter in, to take on the full weight of human experience, including the weight of the silent sins that are most entrenched in the human soul, and to carry it to the cross so that the healing could begin. The warnings he gave about these conditions were themselves acts of love. The physician who names your disease with precision and urgency is not being unkind. They are doing the most genuinely kind thing available to them, ensuring that you understand what you are dealing with in time to do something about it. Jesus spoke these warnings because he believed in the capacity of human souls, when honestly surrendered to the work of grace, to be genuinely and profoundly changed. He believed in it enough to give everything he had on behalf of that possibility. And the grace he offers is not a distant administrative grace that forgives from a remove while leaving the underlying conditions untouched. It is a grace that enters in, that gets its hands into the actual soil of the actual soul, that is powerful enough to soften what has hardened and humble what has swelled, and release what is clenched, and fill what has been emptied, and repair what has been broken. This is the grace that can take a proud heart and give it the tax collector's prayer, a hard heart and give it flesh, a worried soul and give it peace that genuinely passes understanding, an unforgiving spirit and give it the freedom of release, an empty religious life and give it genuine encounter with the living God, a soul enslaved to human opinion and give it the settled freedom of knowing it is beloved beyond what opinion can reach. This is not something you manufacture by effort. It is not a program you execute by discipline, however valuable discipline is as a vehicle for the Spirit's work. It is something you receive through the ongoing practice of surrender, of returning, of bringing the real and unmanaged self into the presence of the real and unlimited God, and trusting that the encounter is safe, that the exposure will not destroy you, that the light is not an enemy. If any of the 12 conditions we have explored today has found a landing place in you, if any of them has struck the chord of honest recognition, produced that interior knowing that says, "This is me in some measure, this is actually me," then I want to say something to you with all the sincerity I can offer through this screen. That recognition is a gift. Do not push it away. Do not immediately cover it with a layer of theological qualifications or self-justifying explanations or the managed assessment that says, "Well, I'm not that bad." Let it land. Let it be true for long enough to take it somewhere. Take it to God, not in performance, not in the carefully composed language of someone who knows how a prayer is supposed to sound, but in the honest, unguarded, unimpressive voice of someone who has just seen something real and needs help with it. Just you and the God who loves you with the real thing in the full light. That conversation, the honest, unmanaged conversation of a soul with the God who made it and knows it and has been patiently waiting for it, is where every genuine transformation in the history of the faith has begun. Not in the dramatic event, not in the public declaration, not in the impressive spiritual experience, but in the private, honest, often inarticulate turning of the soul toward light. God is not waiting for you to arrive with your life sorted out. He never has been, and He never will be. He is waiting for you to come as you are. And wherever you are, whatever the distance between who you have been and who you were made to be, whatever the accumulated weight of the years and the choices and the silent sins that have been operating in the shadows, that distance is not too great for grace to cross. It has never been. Come to the light. Closing call to action. We have come a long way together today, and I am genuinely grateful that you chose to spend this time here. What we explored in this video matters, not as information to be catalogued and forgotten, but as truth to be carried, to be sat with, to be brought honestly before God in the days and weeks ahead. I hope it stays with you. I hope it finds its way into your prayers and your honest self-reflection and the quiet moments when you are most willing to let truth do its work. Before you go, I want to ask you for a few things, not as formalities, but because they genuinely matter to the life of this community and the continuation of this work. If this video has added something real to your life today, if it has given you something to think about, something to feel, something to take into your prayers, something to share with someone who needs it, please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already done so. Hit the subscribe button right now. It is one of the simplest and most significant ways you can support this work and ensure that content like this reaches more of the people who need it. And please turn on your notifications because the next video is coming and I do not want you to miss it. We have so much more to explore together, more scripture to dig into with genuine depth, more questions worth asking honestly, more truth worth sitting with carefully. The content ahead is built with the same care and sincerity that I hope you have experienced today, and I want you to be there for it. If this video moved you, please share it. Send it to a friend who is wrestling with their faith. Send it to a family member who needs to hear something real. Post it in a group chat, share it to your social media. Put it in front of someone who you believe would benefit from it. You never know who is quietly searching for exactly what we talked about today, and your simple act of sharing might be the thing that finds them. That is not a small thing. That is how communities of genuine faith grow, not through algorithms and advertising, but through the organic, human, spirit-led movement of one person saying to another, "Here, this helped me. Maybe it will help you." Please also consider liking this video if it blessed you. It is a small action that has a significant impact on how far this content travels, and it takes only a second. And if you have not yet become a channel member, if you want to go deeper, to be part of the more intentional inner circle of this community, to have early access to videos before they go public, the invitation stands warmly and sincerely. The link is below this video. Members are not just supporters, they are partners. They are the people who make it possible for this work to continue and grow, and they belong to a closer community of people who are serious about their faith and honest about their journey. If that is you, we would love to have you. Wherever you are watching from today, whatever city, whatever country, whatever season of life you find yourself in, know that you are not alone in the questions you carry, or the struggles you face, or the honest longing for something more real than what you have sometimes settled for. That longing is good, that longing is from God, and He is faithful to meet it. May God bless you deeply and keep you. May He cause His face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May He bring you day by day and step by step into greater and greater light, and may you have the courage each time you are invited to stay there. Until next time, go well and go in grace.